This is America's Roundtable from Washington, D.C., a weekly radio program with leading voices from America and international thinkers representing the academia, business, media, think tanks, and the political arena. I am Joel Ansami, your co-host, joined by Natasha Sardoch, economist and co-founder of the International Leaders Summit. At America's Roundtable, we are pleased to have as one of our distinguished guests this weekend, Roger Helmer, a member of the European Parliament representing the United Kingdom. Roger was first elected to the European Parliament in 1999 and has been kept very busy ever since, representing the interests of his 4.1 million constituents from the East Midlands area. During the course of his long business career before 1999, he spent a total of 12 years running businesses in East and Southeast Asia as a resident, so he brings a wealth of detailed information and knowledge of the region to his work on his interparliamentary delegations. Roger has published 2 books on European issues, Straight Talking on Europe in 2000, followed by A Declaration of Independence in 2002.
Right, Roger, I remember you pointed out to a discrepancy with such a concern about emission savings, and on the other hand, European Parliament's monthly relocation between Brussels and Strasbourg, which costs around 200 million euros and emits around 20,000 tons of CO2.
You couldn't make it up, could you? We had this extraordinary press. I mean, I'm often making speeches to groups of people in the UK, and I'm trying to convince them what a wasteful and pointless exercise it is. And I say to people, is anybody here in business? And usually a few hands go up. And I say, well, supposing I told you to close down your business here in wherever it is, let's say Birmingham, and move over the weekend to Glasgow in Scotland, and open your business again, get set up, run your business in Glasgow just for a week, and then close down in Glasgow and move all the way back down to Birmingham again. And then I want you to do the same thing once a month, every month forever. I mean, you would think I was completely mad. And yet that is exactly what we do. And thousands, literally thousands of people move down from Brussels to Strasbourg, and all those thousands of people want to live in hotels and want to eat meals in restaurants. It's a bonanza for the catering trade in Strasbourg. But the message I draw out of this, people say to me, why do we do it? So I say, well, we do have actually a very good reason for doing it, and the reason is we want to keep the French happy. And of course, Strasbourg is in France. France is terribly proud of having what it calls the seat of the European Parliament, although we all know the seat of the European Parliament is really in Brussels. And yes, I suppose we could make one of those horse trading deals that we make in the European institutions with France to get them to agree to stop coming to Strasbourg, but we would have to give them such a big bung in exchange for accepting that decision that we'd be as badly off afterwards. And the conclusion I draw is this, that the European Union is absolutely riddled with programs and policies that nobody can explain, nobody can justify, but nobody can change. There is no real democratic accountability. You know, if you ask people in the street in Britain or probably any member state, do you agree with spending £200 million and emitting all this CO2 in order to move the European Parliament once a month to Strasbourg? They say, no, it's nonsense, you should stop. But there's no mechanism for stopping.
It's unfortunate that we don't have a British serious, yes, minister around, because they would have lots of material for lots of fun programs now.
Well, you really couldn't make it up. One of the phrases I'm constantly using is, you couldn't make it up.
Certainly. In fact, Roger, you've been a great proponent of the Transatlantic Partnership, the important relationship between the United Kingdom and the United States, and the important role that businesses have, individuals, and those that are engaged in various activities across the Atlantic. The transatlantic economy certainly creates significant jobs. It is an important aspect of trade and investments. What do you see as the future of policy or public policy when it comes to the Transatlantic Partnership? Do you see some concerns, or are you optimistic? We'd certainly like to have you weigh in on this particular subject.
Well, indeed, and I think it's a very, very critical relationship for us in Britain. I mean, we are the smaller partner, if you like, of this relationship. So I would quite accept that it may be of not quite the same importance in the States, but I still think it is a valuable relationship for the States. Something that I and those who agree with me on this European question are constantly referring to is the fact that Britain is a much better fit into what we call the Anglosphere, the English-speaking world, than we are a fit with Europe. If you look around the world, we tend to have rather similar legal systems, rather similar accounting systems. That is partly, of course, the result of the Anglosphere historically having largely been created by influence from the UK. And there are huge, it seems to me, commercial opportunities around the world. Something I would love to be able to do is to have Britain apply to join NAFTA. Now, I don't know how many of your listeners are familiar with the concept of a customs union, which is what we've got in Europe. But a customs union is not quite the same thing as a free trade area. And the imbalance is perfectly illustrated by the fact that Mexico, which is in NAFTA, I believe, has a free trade agreement with the European Union. So you might say, well, let's have a similar situation. Why can't Britain have a free trade agreement with NAFTA? And the answer is that a customs union, like the European Union, has a thing called a common external tariff. Imagine a tariff wall around the whole of the European Union, and imports into Europe have to pay the duty at that tariff wall. Now, clearly, it would breach that tariff wall and destroy the whole concept of a customs union if one part of the customs union could make a free trade agreement with someone outside. And you were asking the question earlier on about the origins of the European Union. It was just a customs union and for free trade. But, of course, it is important to distinguish. Customs unions are a very old-fashioned trading concept, and most economists would agree that they're pretty inefficient. Indeed, the European Union is the only customs union in the world of advanced countries. The free trade area is much more flexible, much more efficient, performs much better, and for me, the solution for the European Union would be to abandon its political pretensions and simply turn itself into, if you like, a mirror image of NAFTA. If we had Europe as a free trade area in which we could trade together, cooperate together on a voluntary basis, that would be the kind of Europe that I could actually be a member of quite happily. But it is so important for Britain, I think. We've turned away from our traditional positioning. We were always an outward-looking country. Who was it? Was it Churchill or de Gaulle said that if Britain has to choose between the continent and the Atlantic, it will always choose the Atlantic? And I think we've just gone through a phase when we'd kind of forgotten that and weren't really choosing the Atlantic. And I think now it's really exciting because public opinion in Britain is moving so strongly against the European Union for a range of reasons. We've had the Euro crisis on our televisions, it seems almost nightly for the last 3 years, like some kind of perverse soap opera. So whereas Europe was a bit like the weather, you don't like it very much, but you have to live with it 5 years ago, now it's there, it's immediate, it's a disaster. You can see it's a disaster. And you look at what's going on in Greece, and you can't believe that Greece is a modern Western country. I mean, you're seeing the sort of pictures from Greece that you would almost expect from Somalia. It is just appalling that they've got into that situation. And we look at that from Britain and we say, well, we feel very sorry for the Greek people, but we don't want to go down that route. And there are these constant difficulties with things that you might think were fairly trivial, but bits of European law that make the headlines. We can't send Abu Qatada back to Jordan for trial because, heaven's sakes, there might be some evidence that was potentially obtained from people who were mistreated. So we're spending vast amounts of money on day-to-day surveillance of this guy because we can't put him in jail, we can't send him back to his home country. We just have to leave him here because Europe says so. And there's an issue, for example, of the European Court of Human Rights has decided that jailed convicts have to have the vote. Now, people in Britain, and the House of Commons is pretty much united on this, we take the view that part of your punishment when you're sent to jail is that you lose your freedom, and along with that, you lose a variety of other things, like as many family contacts as you would previously have had, and you lose the right to go down to the pub for a beer, and you lose the right to vote. And I can't see why losing the right to vote is a breach of human rights when you've already put a guy in jail. And there is just so much anger at this interference and the imposition of decisions that just don't seem to ordinary people to make any kind of sense.
Right. And Roger, what are your thoughts about the EU enlargement? And this is not a question only about the enlargement in itself, but also about the next candidate country to join the EU, which is Croatia. Croatia is far from fulfilling the criteria of the rule of law, independent judiciary, protection of property rights, and is on the infamous Balkan route. Just to introduce our listeners to the Balkan route, which is originating in Afghanistan and Iran, with criminals using this route to smuggle heroin, weapons, and sex slaves into Europe. In the arrest of several high-profile Balkan criminals in Spain in February this year, it was discovered that they all possessed fake Croatian passports. Further investigations led directly to Croatia's Ministry of Interior. No high-level officials was held responsible until today. So, Roger, what are your thoughts about the EU enlargement, and in particular into Croatia's question of joining the EU as the next candidate country?
Well, on enlargement generally, I would be happy to have the EU enlarge if we had the sort of EU I've described, a free trade area. Right. But when we're actually giving up our ability to govern ourselves to a group of more and more countries who are more and more remote, I am frankly opposed to enlargement. What's more, I can't see the benefits of enlargement. If you take Turkey, for example, that's been talking about joining the European Union for at least 40 years, they have a special economic arrangement that gives them all sorts of privileges, and frankly, I think they're a lot better off with that arrangement than actually joining as full members and being subject to all the Brussels regulation. But in the case of Croatia, we already have the experience of two countries that have joined the European Union, Romania and Bulgaria, where the rule of law is not well established, and the freedoms that we associate with Western culture and the Western model are not ingrained by any means. And we have what I call the limbo dancing phenomenon. You know, these countries were given a challenge to meet certain criteria, like a limbo dancer having a challenge to sort of get under the bar. And people in Brussels assumed that once you got low enough to get under the bar, you'd stay there. Well, of course, if you watch a limbo dancer, he or she gets under the bar, but as soon as they're under the bar, they get up again. And I fear that's what's happened in the case of Romania and Bulgaria. They did make strenuous efforts to get accepted as accession states. They were accepted, and then, of course, naturally, they relaxed the effort. And I fear the same will be true in Croatia. The recent arrests, I think, probably have to be seen in the context of pressure from Europe to clean up their act before accession. But I fear that pressure will go away. And as you know, I've spent a certain amount of time in Croatia, not very recently, but several years ago. And it certainly didn't seem to me to be, at the time, what I would regard as a free and democratic Western country. So I do have serious concerns about it. But I'm afraid, I voted against it. I voted against the Croatia accession. But unfortunately, I was in a relatively small minority, and so Croatia is indeed expected to join the European Union, and I think that is a concern.
In fact, Roger, your leadership on this efforts of making sure that countries meet the criteria is certainly commendable. In fact, Dr. Daniel Kaufman, a former executive with the World Bank Institute and in fact has served at the Brookings Institution, came up with a report which was published in the Wall Street Journal, which cited the fact that corruption and opaque public finances led to the collapse of the Greek economy. And it seems that the European Union, or Brussels, has not yet learned its lessons. And in fact, countries like Croatia could be the next Greece. And the question ought to be asked, is the EU taxpayer ready to bail out another country which does not have the rule of law and doesn't even have free and fair elections when you have 1 million illegal votes supplanted into the electoral process for a country of 4 million people?
Well, indeed, and the other point, of course, that causes a great deal of angst in the UK is the free movement of people issue, because we did have what is called a derogation, in fact a delay on the application of free movement of people to Romania and Bulgaria, and I think there are about 35 million people in those two countries. That runs out, I think, at the end of this year. So from next year, as many Bulgarians and Romanians who fancy coming across to the UK will be able to do so. And of course, for them, our relatively higher standard of living and relatively generous welfare payments are more attractive than staying home unemployed in Romania. So of course they're going to come, probably in quite large numbers. That's a serious concern. And you're quite right with your reference to Greece and their inability to collect taxes. That was a large part of the Greek problem. And when they could keep devaluing their currency, well, they could cope with that. But of course now they can't because they're in the euro. And you're absolutely right to question the willingness of the remaining solvent countries. In fact, perhaps I should say the remaining solvent country, because really in the Eurozone, it's only Germany. You've probably heard the terrible economic news coming out of France, and Moody's just downgraded the credit rating of France. Germany has got to get the idea that you don't save Greece by having a bailout or two bailouts or three bailouts. You save Greece within the Eurozone, if that's what you want to do, by sending them a check every month and continuing to send them a check every month for the foreseeable future. I mean, a comparison that I make is with the United Kingdom, which you can regard as a sterling single currency area. And the situation is that the Treasury in London sends a regular and very large amount of money to Scotland on a regular basis every year. The level of state funding in Scotland is much higher than the comparable level of state funding per capita in England. And that's called the Barnett formula, because it was set up about 30 years ago by Lord Barnett. And that is the price you pay for keeping Scotland in the sterling currency union. And similarly, if Angela Merkel wants to keep Greece and perhaps Italy and Spain and Portugal and Ireland in the euro currency union, it means permanent long-term transfers from rich countries to poor countries, or in other words, from Germany to southern Europe.
In fact, Roger, we certainly do thank you for your time, and I believe Natasha has one final question. And
very good.
This has been very helpful for our listeners on America's Roundtable.
Right, Roger.
Well, it's been a pleasure.
Right. Roger, you mentioned that currently around 75% of British laws are created by unaccountable institutions in Brussels, that economic recovery is threatened by bureaucracy and red tape. The EU controls immigration, business and employment, financial services, fishing, farming, law and order, energy and trade. And it also seeks to control your foreign affairs and taxes. The EU directly costs the UK £50 million a day when we take just contribution, or actually EU budget contributions, and the vast costs of EU regulation are more likely £250 million a day. There are so many reasons for British to think about staying in the EU. Roger, do you see Britain leaving the EU in the near future?
I think we are closer to an EU exit than we have been throughout my political career, because we have a situation where the Eurozone has decided that the only solution for them, I think it's the wrong solution, but it's their decision, is to integrate more closely and more fully and have a central treasury, a central fiscal policy, and so on. Now, we in Britain simply cannot accept that, so we have to negotiate a new relationship. Our current Prime Minister, although he wants to stay in the European Union, is committed to renegotiating and bringing back powers. He will find that's extremely difficult, but the political pressure in Britain for a referendum of some kind on Europe is getting stronger and stronger, and the British people are increasingly sceptical and indeed increasingly hostile is the only word I can use to our European Union membership. We want to rejoin the rest of the world, and we look forward to doing so.
And on this note, we conclude our time on America's Roundtable with Roger Helmer, a member of the European Parliament representing the United Kingdom. And Roger, we look forward to our continued discussion on important issues in Europe as well as the transatlantic economy.
Thank you, Roger.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you very much indeed.
This is America's Roundtable. Visit us at americasrt.com. Follow us on Twitter at americasrt. You can find us on YouTube and Facebook. like and share.